For the love of Abu Fadl Abbas ibn Amir al-Mu'mineen, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We have those in our community who are unwell and in need. بحق أبو الفاضل, let us ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for shifa'a for all of them. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ثم جعلناك على شريعة من الأمر فاتبعها ولا تتبع أهواء الذين لا يعلمون إنهم لن يغنوا عنك من الله شيئا وإن الظالمين بعدهم أولياء بعض والله ولي المتقين. هذا بصائر للناس وهدى ورحمة لقوم يوقنون. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our 8th discussion in our series looking at Islam in Britain and Britain in Islam, the decade 2020 to 2030. In the last couple of discussions, we have been looking at the challenge of the rise of the far right and the return of proto-fascism across the world. And 2 nights ago we looked at the 4 main arguments of the far right, and we also looked at some of the responses, and in particular how we as a Muslim community, in order to protect the rights of all in society, in order to ensure the protections of minority groups in society, must take a lead in the response to fight against the rise of the far right here in Britain. And last night we discussed the issue of integration and how there are opportunities that are mentioned in the Quran as to how to ensure our integration is best achieved as a two-way street, and to ensure that when we spend our religious finances, our humus, our zakat and our sadaqat, how to be able to utilize and apply those finances in a way that would reach towards the antagonists that may have misunderstood the Muslim community or may have misunderstood the immigrant community, and so when it reaches them is a means to help them better understand the values of Islam and turn their antagonism into love. Turn their antagonism into genuine friendship. And this came from a Quranic verse in chapter number 9, Surah At-Tawbah, verse number 60. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions amongst the 8 categories of those deserved of our finances, our Islamic taxes, one of them to be مُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُمْ, those whose hearts may incline towards Islam. We mentioned the plethora of narrations from the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, where the Imam would mention that the Prophet would spend on his greatest of enemies, such as Abu Sufyan. And the reason for that was that as Abu Sufyan's power dwindled, also so did his esteem dwindle. For a person previously who had such power, wealth and authority, Islam wasn't seeking to take away his wealth. It wasn't seeking to make him in a position of embarrassment in his own society. Islam has no concern in doing that to a human being. But so as people from the Quraysh began to leave his way of thinking, there was a space to be able to help Abu Sufyan in the things that he cared for so dearly, which was his material position. Therefore, if there is a means to be able to spend on him and help him to elevate back towards a position of esteem, Islam would do so, caring for his personal circumstances. Now, of course, irrespective of whether this worked on Abu Sufyan or not, Islam's position is that we have responsibilities even towards our enemies or towards our antagonizers. In the context of where we live, and we were talking yesterday about Rotherham and Leeds and other such places, that we find that there is a real problem with hunger, whereby children are going hungry. Because the government and its austerity measures have removed things like free school lunches, children from especially the white working class background are going to school hungry, even going out and stealing food. What then becomes the obligation on the Muslim community? And how can we apply ta'leef, mu'allafata qulubihim? How can we actually apply this as a means of pushing back against the enmity of certain classes and groups within this society? And this is something that we need to think about strategically as one example. There are many other ways. For example, we know that those very same children who may not be able to eat, they may also not have the basics for their school needs. It's the beginning of the school year. School uniform, or it may be the issue of pens and pencil cases, the things that they need, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to be food only, but there is space to be able to economically uplift a particular group of people who are feeling vulnerable, afraid, and also that if the immigrant community comes and takes their jobs, this is why they are not able to meet ends meet. Therefore, if we are able to assist with those people, we may be able to turn the thinking of certain groups towards love of the Prophet Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Tonight we start on a different topic altogether, and we are going to be discussing the issue in regards to women and how Islam can actually be a resort for women. When we say resort, we don't mean a holiday destination, right? This isn't a nice beach on Egypt. We are talking about a resort, a place of stay, a place where a person feels comfortable, a place where a person feels that it can be their destination. And we want Islam to be that for women. And we also want to understand certain narratives that are created at the beginning of the discussion about why Islam is not, apparently, is not a place for women to be comfortable in, or as a place of resort for women to be comfortable in. So particularly, we want to be able to ask about how we can actually make this a place for women to feel comfortable. And one of the particular ideas for us is to understand what is the master narrative and how is it that certain ideas have come into the West and how we're able to challenge those. At the end of it, what we're going to be looking at, inshallah, is one particular verse of the Quran. And we're going to challenge the master narrative that women are downtrodden and oppressed in Islam through only one verse of the Quran. And the idea is to see how that one verse can actually be means of empowerment in all given circumstances that women may find themselves to either be oppressed or find themselves to be in a state of anxiety or fear. And inshallah, if we're able to navigate this verse properly, we will really be able to understand how Islam held this discussion to assist women in their growth at the time of the Prophet, and how this is the example for us in our own time today. Now, we need to go through one or two preamble points. Some of the points we're going to be discussing tonight is about how the feminist movement, especially from the 16th to 19th century, impacted religion and specifically impacted the Muslim community, such that those master narratives are created. Let us define master narrative. What do we mean by this term, master narrative? Does anyone know how we can define what we mean by master narrative? A master narrative are those highest level assumptions that create a way of thinking that feed down and inform everything else that you understand about that one particular subject. Every science has master narratives, and you will also see that over given periods of time, master narratives have always changed. There's a scholar, and we'll be talking about him a lot more tomorrow night, probably, by the name of Dr. Richard Bullitt. And he is a giant thinker, probably one of the world's leading historians. We're going to be talking about his books probably tomorrow night. If not, then the night after. Dr. Richard Bullitt is a professor of history and also Middle Eastern studies at Columbia University in the United States of America. And he often talks about master narratives because he's a historian and because he's also a geographer of the Middle East. And he gives an example of what a master narrative is in order for us to make it very simple to understand, and then it will help us to transition to our discussion about women and the master narratives that are created about Islam and women. And he says, look, if you go back to historical readings, in history, women were by and large almost never spoken about. And he says prior to 1950, you will never see accounts of women. You will never really see how women are spoken about other than things like if there happened to be a queen who was a woman. Queen Victoria or something like that. Queen Elizabeth or something like that. And he says only once the 1950s came and women themselves were able to start writing about history, they would then review the history and talk about history also from a woman's lens or from a woman's experience. But prior to 1950, very rarely would you find anything like that. So history was completely reconstructed by men for men. Only from 1950 onwards, at the level of the global understanding of women's roles in history, will women actually be included in the history itself. He gives another example. He says, I'm from a particular town in Illinois. You know the state of Illinois in the United States? He says, I'm from a particular town. He goes, all my life, I've been told that this town was built by two men. And eventually one day when I went back, you know they had like town museums and you can go and just read about the history of your own city and own town. So I went back and actually, much later, I found out that actually it was three men. There was two white men and one of them had a black slave And also this black slave was one of the founders of my city. But of course, we would never know this until black individuals were able to write history. And when they were able to write history, they would include themselves in the history and not be pushed aside. So at one level, you can see here the master narratives. So long as women are excluded, then we can never see history through the lens of a woman or the experience of a woman. So long as the black society were only slaves and didn't have the education to participate or the space to participate in academia and history, then we would only get history through the lens of a white man. Make sense? These are master narratives. And only when we can make inclusivity do master narratives begin to change. When it comes to women, there are certain master narratives that are told about Islam. And we need to be able to know how those master narratives came about, what they said, and then the impact that they had on both Middle Eastern experiences, Muslim experiences, and Western experiences of the relationship between Islam and women, in order for us to understand how it's impacted them today and even impacted us today. And then we can go back into a review of what the Quran says and see whether some of these matters are actually matching up or not. Now, do you recall on a previous night, one of the things we were talking about was the effect of the Enlightenment period. Do you remember this? Do you remember we were saying that when religions weren't productive for human beings, nay, the opposite, when the religions themselves were oppressive towards people, or they were actually backwards, people would flee these religions because they found secularism to be more productive for their life. Remember we gave the example of slavery. Islam was supposed to start the whole movement of freeing slaves, correct? But it was the Muslim countries that actually enforced slavery on people. So now, if you were a slave, at the time of the Prophet came and liberated you. He gave you that freedom. He gave you that strength. He gave you that education. He gave you that money to be able to start a free life. 1200 years later, whilst the white man is dying, physically dying on the battlefield in America in order to free slaves, it is the Muslim who is reinforcing slavery. The Civil War in the United States of America was fought over what? Slavery. So whilst the South wanted to reinforce slavery, it was Christians and whites that were in the North trying to free slaves. Now, of course, there are multiple trends. I'm just giving you a broad image here for a second. So now, if someone came to you as a slave and said there is these Muslims that want to enforce the slavery upon you, there's the South that want to enforce the slavery upon you, and then these Christians in the North that want to free you from slave, or there's atheists that want to free you from slavery, or there's secularists that think slavery is immoral, which one is going to appeal to you? It's obvious, isn't it? This is what was happening in the Enlightenment period. That religion wasn't productive, and so many people fled religion because of the way in which it was. Similarly, when it came to women's issues were also being used as a means to scapegoat Islam and as a means to try to present the Western world as being superior to the Middle Eastern world. How did they do it? They did it in a way of saying that look how enslaved Muslim women are. And they would present the picture of Muslim women to be nothing more than pieces of meat, literally, for men's pleasure. And so Western women, you really want that religion? If you convert to that religion, this is what will end up happening to you. So this dichotomy was created of the way in which Muslims were being presented and how the West was created to have a moral superiority. And so if you were a woman who was being introduced to Islam, there would be no way you would want to consider Islam because of the way in which Muslims were treating women and the way in which it was being presented to you as to the way in which Muslims were treating women. I'm going to show you some examples of this so you understand specifically what I mean. A couple of nights I've been showing you this phenomenal book, Islam and Liberalism, by Joseph Masad, or Yusuf Mas'ud, and in here he has a whole chapter on the whole movement in the West to try to present Islam as backwards and liberalize women, and how they did it from the 16th to the 20th century. I'm going to read one or two passages for you to be able to reconstruct what was happening at this time and what master narratives were being created in the minds of people. So he gives us a quote, and he says the following. He says, as an example, in 1906, Christian women missionaries in Cairo, in Egypt, said the following: "We, the women missionaries assembled at the Cairo conference, would send this appeal on behalf of the women of the Muslim lands to all women's missionary boards. We would send an appeal on behalf of Muslim women to committees in Great Britain, America, Canada, France, Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Holland, Australia, and New Zealand. We, the white women in Cairo, would send a letter of appeal to help Muslim women, and we sent it to all of these countries." Let's take a quote from that particular letter that was sent to all of these countries. It says, "We want to bemoan the horrible conditions of Muslim women. The same story has come from India, Persia, Arabia, Africa, and other Muhammadan lands, making evident that the condition of women under Islam is everywhere the same, and that there is no hope of effectually remedying the spiritual, moral, and physical ills which women suffer, except to take them to the message of the Saviour Jesus Christ, and that there is no chance of their healing unless we give ourselves to that work. No one else will do it. No one else in the world is going to save these poor Muslim women. No one else is going to do it. This lays a heavy responsibility on all Christian women." So what's being said here? That women across the world are being told of the despicable situation that Muslim women are in, and we can't break them, we can't remove them from the situation that they're in unless and until that they meet and are introduced to Jesus Christ, their personal Lord and Saviour. Now imagine, if you're in Norway, if you're in Switzerland, if you're in Australia, if you're in Holland, it's unlikely in the late 1800s and 1900s that you would have met too many Muslim women. Fair? In fact, even until today, do you know that there are some Americans, when they're interviewed about their understanding of Muslims, till today, do you know what they actually say? We've never met a Muslim. Never met a Muslim. So all they're being told about in regards to Islam and Muslim women is second-hand information. But now if you're in the 1900s and you're receiving these letters from white Christian women to other white Christian women being told that there is a despicable situation here and only we, the Christian women, have the capacity to liberate these poor Muslim women, we are the ones to have to do the work, what do you think that society is going to think about Muslim women? But also, what do you think their approach now is going to be about Muslim women? The missionary work came off the back of this. This is an example of what was being told to them in 1906. Now, a little bit before this, there were other things going on as well. As an example, in 1721, there was a number of letters that were written, which were called Persian letters, that Muslim women were basically represented as nothing more as enslaved harems for men. So actually, the way in which they were presented as being nothing more than this. The reason as to why in 1700s Muslim women were being presented as nothing more as harems. Everyone knows what harems are? Yes? Yes? Yeah, like a group of women that are just there for the pleasure of men. Yeah, so since the 1700s, letters are coming to white women of Europe, of North America, saying all that Muslim women are nothing more than harems of men. The purpose of this was that they wanted to scandalize Christian women, to say that if you find goodness in Islam and you convert to Islam, this is what's going to happen to you. It was a scare tactic, basically, what was happening at that time. So he says the following: such were the dominant views of Muslim women, which were first propagated by Orientalist European Christian male travelers of the 18th century. Andrea, one of the scholars, reviews this literature and how patriarchal male travel literature was deployed in order to limit the rights of European Christian women who were depicted as living in paradise, threatening them with the imagined slavery of Muslim women if they get out of line. If they get out of line. Meaning that if Christian women were to speak for themselves, if Christian women wanted to have any sort of liberation, we threaten you that you end up like Muslim women, enslaved harems of men. So you can see here certain narratives that are being created about how women are treated in Islam. This is the first thing. Second thing is to show you a certain slide, or a couple of slides, to be able to appreciate a second trend that was going on in regards to how women were thinking and how women were being treated at that time. Second slide, inshallah. So if you remember, I mentioned to you on a previous night about feminism. And I mentioned that there's 3 or 4 waves of feminism. And that the first wave of feminism believed that the only way we could have freedom as women was if we got rid of God and religion. Why? Because it was God that instituted our slavery. How so? As example, as you know in the Christian theology, women are created from what? The rib of the man. Whose fault is it that Adam fell? Eve's fault. So here, woman initially in her creation is secondary to man. And the reason why we're all stuck on this planet and not all chilling in heaven and enjoying all those, rivers of honey and lakes and whatever else that it might be there is because of women. Obviously, Islam doesn't believe this. But that was what was presented in Christianity, correct? So white women in this movement were saying, it's God himself that has actually enslaved us. It's Christianity itself that is causing us to be oppressed. Therefore, in order to get rid of our oppression, we need to disbelieve in God and we need to remove Christianity. This was the first wave of feminism. All of feminism was initially built off this idea that in order to get freedom and equality and equity, we had to destroy religion. Let me prove it to you and show you their own statements in the history of feminism itself. Is it up there? Ahsanta. So as an example, I'm quoting to you from Susan B. Anthony. In 1820 to 1906 she lived, and she says the following: the worst enemy women have is the pulpit. Now, of course, here she's talking about the Christian pulpit. But she would universalize this, that this is all pulpits are there to essentially oppress women. The worst enemy women have is in the pulpit. I cannot imagine a God of the universe made happy by my getting down on my knees and calling him great. So where's the rejection? God and religion, isn't it? Why? Because apparently religion is that tool to enslave and oppress women. Next slide, inshallah. As another example of one of the great early feminists, Helen H. Gardner, she states in her writings, this religion and the Bible require of woman everything and give her nothing. They ask her support and her love and repay her with contempt and oppression. Every injustice that has ever been fastened upon women in a Christian country has been authorized by the Bible and riveted and perpetuated by the pulpit. Thank you, Sayyid. So we have three things going on here, don't we? Number one, that Islam and the way in which it treats women is being presented to the Western world as being oppressive. And that Western women have to come and save Middle Eastern women, number one. Number two, it's a scare tactic. If you convert out of your Christianity, if you get out of line and ask for any rights, if you try to get votes, if you try to be able to inherit anything, if you want your suffragette movement, you'll end up like Muslim women, enslaved in a harem for men. Number two. And number three, the counter trend was religion itself is the problem. Therefore, if you want to be liberated, you need to liberate yourself from God and religion. These are the three master narratives that were created about women and Islam. And so the whole of the Western world were told these three master narratives. And that's what they understood about women and Islam. The problem was that for most of it was true. The way in which men treated women, and the way in which until today men treat women, it was still true. And so both Muslim women didn't find space with Islam, the way in which it was being preached to them, and Western women didn't find comfort, resort in Islam because of the way in which it was presented to them. I saw a tweet today, and it was really interesting to me. And a young male tweeted out an experience that he has. And he says, I'm talking to a young lady for marriage, and I asked her, what is the one thing that you need from me? What's the one thing that you really are asking for me from this marriage? You know, when you get together, you talk, you want to get to know your potential spouse. It's a good question, isn't it? What do you need from me? What are you afraid of? What do you want from this marriage? You know what she said? She said, all I want is a husband that doesn't have anger issues and won't flip out, hit me, beat me if I do something. And then he tweeted and said, just imagine a woman in 2019 in the UK has to still say, the one thing I hope I don't get in this marriage is someone with anger issues, such that I'm going to be oppressed, physically abused, emotionally abused. That's where we are still. That's actually where we are. I remember I was conducting a marriage discussion in New York. So this isn't India, this isn't Kenya, this is New York. You can't get any more cosmopolitan, any more progressive than New York. I don't mean that in a bad way to the Jamaat there. Yeah, I just mean that that's the the big apple of the world. The sisters, when we were asking them about your fears for marriage and the issues that you're finding are continuously cropping up in your community, you know what they said? They mentioned two. I won't mention the second because it's not relevant right now. But you know the first thing they said? That we are now encouraged as young women to become educated, right? We're encouraged to go to university, have a degree, have a good career. And it's often the case that we end up in a position which is either higher than our husbands or we end up making more money than our husbands. You know our biggest problem is that we're told go out and be independent, go out and earn, go out and have a successful career. The biggest problem we have is that there's an inferiority complex, that when we marry men, they feel inferior because we've gone out and got an education. We're still there. That's still where we are as people. That these fears are still in our sisters. Surely we have to, by now in 2019, have managed to get rid of these practices within ourselves. Surely it's not befitting of us, either as individuals or as a collective,
to still have these practices within us. So as much as these three trends were being told about Islam, that Islam is oppressive, that Islam itself does this, that the community does this, that you have to get rid of religion in order to save, how much of the experience of that is also true has to be questioned as well. Whether or not it plays into one narrative or not, I'm not interested in. The question is, how true is it? That the way in which the religion is being interpreted is oppressive, and the way in which the religion is being utilized is oppressive in and of itself. Now, if you imagine that this is the situation that's being presented in the West until today, if we're going to challenge this, then we actually need to think about how we're going to challenge this such that when we speak to women in the West, when we speak to people about Islam, we change these master narratives about how Islam is perceived about women and the way in which women are understood to be in Islam. Now, what's really interesting to me, just as a reflection, just take a step back for a second. We're in the wave, or in the cusp of a wave of things like the hashtag #MeToo movement. Do people know what I mean by hashtag #MeToo? Yeah? Hashtag #MeToo is the movement to say, me too, I've also been abused. Either physically, emotionally, or sexually. And many women will, on their Facebook or on their Twitter or something, they'll put their own narrative that explain what they've had done to them. And for example, there's many, many discussions about this that's happening in the world. But not just hashtag #MeToo, but other things. Things like how much a woman gets paid and whether they get paid the equivalent amount of a man. We're still having to deal with these issues. So actually, in half the world, there is a whole conversation taking place about rights, about roles and responsibilities, about access to healthcare, access to education, access to things that often you and I take for granted. I ask a simple question. If the Islam of the Prophet was presented, and I don't mean here as a fiqhi understanding of Islam, I'm talking about the way in which the Prophet put this issue at the forefront of his agenda, don't you imagine that so much of this world would be eager to understand how the Prophet was? Let's mention some of these points just to review what we talked about on one of the earlier nights. Do you remember we stated that if you were a woman and you were to be born, a girl, what was the first thing that would happen to you? You would be buried alive, which is called female infanticide. You'd be buried alive. If you managed to survive that, then you would be likely married off at the age of 6, 7, 9, or something like that. You would have no education, no rights, no ability to speak, no ability to demand for yourself. You were there for nothing more than the physical pleasure of man. If you managed to survive that, and your husband then had a gambling debt, the culture would be that men would then sell their own wives off temporarily into prostitution to pay off their own gambling debts. Remember, it's not me that says this. This is what the Quran and the Ahadith say. لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not eat up wealth amongst yourselves in falsities. That's a hadith of the 6th Imam Jaffer Ladak, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. And multiple more issues that were there. Now, look at this verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. It's in one of the final verses of Surah At-Tawbah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Azizun alayhi ma anittum. This verse, just this verse, is enough to help you understand everything that you need to understand about this movement. Azizun alayhi. Grievously difficult it is for the Prophet what you suffer. A man is putting himself in the position of those who suffer. The poor, the early Muslims that were being attacked physically, the hungry and the destitute. But if you have half of society, 50% of the world, women, who are treated the way in which they were, do you not imagine the man who Allah Jalla Jalaluhu calls Rahmatun lil Alameen, a mercy for mankind? Another verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He used to hurt so much over those people that He used to almost die out of grief for them. فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِئٌ نَفْسَكَ عَلَىٰ آثَارِهِمْ. The softness of this man, the Prophet, was that whenever something bad happened to someone else, he himself felt the pain of those issues. The Quran says, عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ. It is grievously difficult for the Prophet to have to bear what you're undergoing. Do you not then imagine how the Prophet felt when he used to see the extent of the oppression on women in that time? And did he not place it at the spearhead of his whole movement to be able to assist this group? We mentioned, of course, stopping the infanticide, raising the position of women, to the extent that when his daughter would walk into the masjid, the Prophet would stand up out of honor for her. Not because she was Sayyidatin Nisa al-Alameen. As Dr. Ali Shari'ati says, Fatima is Fatima, because Fatima herself deserved to be stood up for. The greatest messenger and creation of all existence stood up for this woman as she entered into the masjid. Look at the way the Prophet evolved the whole thinking of men towards women. He would say, paradise is underneath the feet of your mother. To whom should you respect the most? Your mother. And then whom? Your mother. And then whom? Your mother. And then the Prophet would say, the best of men amongst you are those who are best towards his wives. Hadith after hadith after hadith, molding the thinking and the practices. And it's obvious why so many women would convert towards Islam, because they found a resort there for them. Now, I think here in this community, maybe 5 years ago, you've had an excellent scholar come to you, Sayyid Hussein Qazwini. Sayyid Hussein Qazwini, he actually has a Bahth Kharij, which you know is ijtihad. He's teaching ijtihad. He has a Bahth Kharij on fiqh al-mar'a, the fiqh of women. It's maybe around 100 videos. You know, in one of his videos, he mentions the following. He says, for all the issues we can raise with the feminist movement, and I've just raised one of them to prove why I'm not a feminist, right? Because we don't need to go back to that external understanding to inform Islam of our understanding. We need Islam to inform us of Islam. But he says this, for all of the issues that we have with feminism, you know the one thing that feminism has done to Shia Islam? These are his words, and I agree with them. He says, because of all these questions about rights and responsibilities and the roles and how Islam is supposed to treat women, because the feminist movement has done it, it has even forced Maraji' to come and review their own laws. As an example, His Eminence Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Kamal al-Haydari, Dama Tawfiqahu, he has hundreds of lectures, Bahth Kharij, on fiqh al-mara. Why? Sayyid Hussein says, as a response to the trends of what's happening, it tells us that even the Hawza is having to change its understanding to keep up with the pace of the development of what is going on. Now, I want to do two things, and I just want to be able to show, number one, how the Quran speaks from the perspective of a woman, number one, and number two, to show you one verse of the Quran that I argue is the central verse that proves how Islam helps women in any given situation, in any given time, such that if we were to understand this verse, we would apply it here in Britain in a way that would be at the forefront of women's liberation, women's rights and women's movement in 2019 and be able to help with the way in which Islam assists the movement of women in the forthcoming decade. What I have in, if I can find it, is some verses from Surah Maryam. Now we all know Surah Maryam is there to be able to tell us the story of Lady Maryam, salamullahi alayha. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. I want you to see some of these verses and some of the language that is used and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of this issue and the type of empowerment that is given. You see, for those who do serious tadabbur and tafsir of Quran, every word is important. One of the things that we've been talking about in these last few nights is that we stated when you see a verse in the Quran, put yourself into that verse of Quran. Imagine you are saying that verse. Or imagine that verse was revealed about you. Do you remember us saying that? Right? As an example, the men would say, أَجَعَلَ آلِهَةَ إِلَهًا وَاحِدًا إِنَّ هَذَا لَشَيْءٌ عَجَابٌ. Does this man, Rasulullah, make all of our gods into one God? What a strange thing this is. Put yourself into the verse. Understand what it must have been like to say those words. Why would you say those words? The story of Lady Maryam alayha salam is unique in the Quran because it speaks from the perspective of a woman. That's very important. Because it means that because it's the Quran, it's the perfect, unblighted words of Allah, protected until the end of time. And it means it gives us an understanding as to how a woman thinks and how a woman reacts, and gives us an appreciation of how we can build our own understanding of women's rights and women's movements. Have a look at some of these verses with me, inshallah. For example, from verse number 16 in Surah Maryam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the following. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ مَرْيَمَ. And mention in the book the story of Lady Maryam alayhi salam. Now, think about this. وَاذْكُرْ. What does it mean? Do the dhikr. Mention. Talk about it. It's a fi'l amr. It's a command, isn't it? It's telling you to do it. So it's telling us, number one, that we are supposed to recount the story of Lady Maryam. We are supposed to talk about it. Allah is telling you, commanding you, actually go and talk about it. Actually raise the issue and talk about her. We end up doing things like, once a year, as a token gesture, when it comes to the 25th of December, maybe, just maybe, if the khatib has any sense about him, he may end up talking on the Jummah khutbah about how we have some similarities about Lady Maryam alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, mention it, talk about it, bring it to the forefront of the discussion. وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ مَرْيَمَ إِذِ انْتَبَذَتْ مِنْ أَهْلِهَا مَكَانًا شَرْقِيًّا. When she withdrew herself from her family to a distant, a remote place. انْتَبَذَتْ. She withdrew herself. Tell me something. At that time, forget today, at that time, 2,000 years ago, were women able to withdraw themselves from their men? Take themselves out of their initial place and go somewhere? Even today, if you imagine, if you ask, can women actually have the freedom to go and do something? We will see that often there is no freedom. Correct? Can she go to university? Can she make her own decisions? Lady Maryam alayhi salam in the Quran, she withdrew herself from her family in order to go to a remote place. What does that tell you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking here about the empowerment, the decision making of this great lady to be able to do something for herself. إِذِ انْتَبَذَتْ, when she withdrew, مِنْ أَهْلِهَا, from her family, مَكَانًا شَرْقِيًّا, to a remote place. فَاتَّخَذَتْ مِنْ دُونِ حِجَابًا. Where did she go? She went to the temple. She went to the temple to go and worship, and traditionally, the temple was a place of worship for only men. Only men. Women were not allowed in there, let alone worshipping in there, let alone staying in there. It was a man-only world. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling you?
Women are allowed to.
Not only that women are allowed to, but she herself took her to that place, in a place where conceivably was normally only for men, and she placed herself in that place. فَاتَّخَذَتْ مِن دُونِهِمْ حِجَابًا. So she took for herself a hijab. Now it doesn't mean hijab scarf. It means a barrier between the men and the women. What do you take from this? Do tadabbur of the Quran with me. What do you take from this? That she took for herself an extra layer of hijab that was appropriate for her. Yes, of course she would have been fully covered. But she was going to worship. So she took for herself a space that she could have for herself, breaking the practices of the men, that this is only a space for us, it's a boys' club, it's a men's club, women don't get to sit in there. She broke the norms of her family, she broke the norms of her community, and then to protect herself and her dignity, she took an extra layer of hijab where she took like a curtain or a veil between herself and the men. فَاتَّخَذَتْ مِن دُونِهِمْ حِجَابًا فَأَرْسَلْنَا إِلَيْهَا رُوحَنَا فَتَمَثَّلَ لَهَا بَشَرًا سَوِيًّا. So we sent to her, Lady Maryam alayhi salam, ruhana, our ruh. Who is our ruh? Who is that? Jibreel alayhi salam. So we sent to her Jibreel alayhi salam, فَتَمَثَّلَ لَهَا بَشَرًا سَوِيًّا. And he came in the example, in the form of a well-molded, good-looking man. Strong, tall, a good height man. Yes? So she is alone in this space in which she is worshipping Allah, and immediately appears to her a very large man, a very tall man. Be honest, be honest. What do you think she felt?
Intimidated.
Ahsant. If she's a woman, and all of a sudden a large built man is standing in front of her, don't you think she would feel fear? Yes. It tells us that she did feel fear. قالت, she says, إِنِّي أَعُوذُ بِالرَّحْمَنِ مِنْكَ. I seek refuge from you. Now if she knew at that moment it was Jibreel, which cannot do sin, which is Allah's messenger, would she need to seek refuge from him? No. So clearly she thinks that this is a man, a human being. What does it tell us? She was afraid at that moment. SubhanAllah, Allah is telling us about the reaction of this lady. Lady Maryam, salamullahi alayha. Maryam. What is that supposed to invoke in you as a reader when you read this? If you read this and you actually base your reading on reflection and not just da-da-da-da-da, I want to finish the end of the surah as quickly as possible and think I got my thawab. If you actually ponder and place yourself into this position. Have you ever felt fear in your life? Have you ever felt fear in your life? Have you ever felt fear in your life? Is it good? Now what are you supposed to be understanding from this story when the Sayyida of Nisa'il Alameen, of her time, has fear put into her? What are you supposed to be taking away as a man when you read this?
Shame.
Why shame?
That my gender is responsible for making half the gender feel afraid.
Yeah.
Just for our existing.
Not even shame, but I wouldn't want Her Eminence, Sayyida Maryam alayhi salam, to ever feel fear, would I? Would you? I wouldn't want any woman to feel fear because of me. You know women today? You know what women today have to go through? Ask them. Ask them on the drive home when you sit with your wives, your daughters, your mothers. When they walk out at night, the fear that they have. They tell them, put on a ring, even if you're not married, put on a ring so it looks like you're married. Be on the phone, pretend to be on the phone so you don't get attacked. Do you know that's the kind of advice that women get in this country until today? Let alone what happens in India. Let alone what happens in Pakistan. Look at what the Quran is telling us. Sayyida Salamullahi alayha felt fear because of a man. What did I tell you earlier on about that tweet? That man asked his potential future spouse, what's the one thing you're afraid of when you get married? I'm afraid I'll end up marrying a man who makes me afraid. The Muslim who reads this verse would be ashamed to make a woman afraid of him. قالت إني أعوذ بالرحمن منك إن كنت تقيا. If you really have taqwa, I really fear. I'm reminding you that you do have taqwa. Fear God, so that I don't have to have any fear of you. قال إنما أنا رسول ربك لأهب لك غلاما زكيا. And then Jibreel begins to talk to her and tell her that Allah is going to give you Isa alayhi salam. And there's much more. But what am I saying here? Number one, Maryam alayhi salam, she took herself out from her family. She defied her family norm. Allah didn't say anything negative. She defied the cultural norm. Allah didn't say anything negative. She was there worshipping, and a man came towards her. She feared because of a man. Allah is telling us the story of a woman from a woman's perspective, so that we're able to understand and actually change our own behavior and how we think about women and how we would treat a woman off the back of this. I'll tell you this, and I say this wherever I go, and I don't care, I do not care who dislikes this statement. I am ashamed of the Shia that cries over Umar ibn al-Khattab beating Fatima, and then that Shia has the audacity to go home and beat his own wife. And any man that does that has the audacity to cry over the dhulm, the madhlumiyya of Sayyida Zahra alayhi salam, and then goes home and does that to his own wife, shouldn't bother crying over the madhlumiyya of Lady Fatima. What tears are you crying? What tears are you crying? And any man that then goes home having cried over the slaps that Khuli and Shimr give to Ruqayya and Lady Sakina, and then goes home and does the same thing to his own children, I am ashamed of you as a Shia. What tears are you crying? Really, what tears are you crying? Have you bothered to listen to the story, or are these all crocodile tears? Like I said, I don't care if someone takes offense to that statement. Reflect on it. Why are you crying over Lady Fatima alayhi salam? Why are you crying over Ruqayya and Sakina if you have exactly the same behavior in you? You're coming here just to, what, this is entertainment? The whole of this story in the Quran is there to awaken us to the reality. One last verse I want to be able to show you, and this is the kicker. If we understand this verse, I believe we are able to change the way society is through the lens of Islam and the empowerment that Islam gives to Muslim women and to all women. Say it, is the verse up? Is the next slide up, inshallah? Now I'm going to show you a really controversial verse, and we're going to have a lot of fun with this verse. Yeah? Because you know me, I like to have fun with you guys and ask you questions and help me to understand this religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this beautiful religion. This verse is one of the most controversial verses in the Quran. When I say controversial, obviously there's no such thing as controversy in its real sense, but it's only the lack of my own thinking that makes something controversial. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 282, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَاسْتَشْهِدُوا شَهِيدَيْن مِنَ الرِّجَالِكُمْ فَإِنْ لَمْ يَكُونَا رَجُلَيْنِ فَرَجُلٌ وَامْرَأَتَانِ مِمَّنْ تَرْضَوْنَ مِنَ الشُّهَدَاءِ أن تظل إحداهما فتذكر إحداهما الأخرى. And call to witness 2 witnesses from amongst your men. And if there are not 2 men, then a man and 2 women from amongst those whom you approve of as witnesses, so that if one of the 2 women errs, the other can remind her. What do we know about this verse? It's a sensitive one, isn't it? What do we know about this verse? This verse apparently is telling us that if there is a need to witness, and you need 2 men, but in the absence of one of those men, you can take 2 women in replacement of that one man. So that suggests at face value that the testimony of a woman is half that of a man. And it also says, it qualifies, if she errs, the reason for the second woman witness is to remind the first. Now, help me out here. What is the reason, in your understanding, my understanding, what is the reason for this situation? What do we normally think of when we get, why is it that we need 2 women for every 1 man witness? What's the reason for it? Is it that she doesn't have the same intellectual level? Is it that just her testimony in and of itself is worth half of a man? What's the reason in your minds?
The society problem, the misconception.
Misconceptions in society?
Society.
Ahsan. So I'm going to show you one of the Maraji', may Allah bless him, and his commentary on this. Next slide, inshallah. And I put the original from his tafsir, and I've written the translation as well for you. So, he says the following. Perhaps the emotion and tenderness, perhaps the emotion and tenderness overcomes her in her testimony, deviating the woman from the line of justice in witnessing and taking her astray from her guidance. So because she has this softness and tenderness and emotion, it may be that when she gives testimony, she will deviate from the truth. She will deviate from what's 100% correct, from the line of justice, taking her astray into misguidance. This is a traditional understanding. He continues, especially if the atmosphere of the case, she's witnessing a case, suggests there's been a tragedy that affects her, either as the witness or the defendant. Meaning that if she sees something tragic in her life, and that she's personally involved, she has some vested interest in the case, she is likely to err in her testimony. So then you should bring a second one to back her up and tell her, no, you were wrong about how you testified. This is actually what happened in the incident. What do you think so far? Be honest. I'm not making any judgment. What do you think so far? So here it's saying that a woman is essentially, potentially, likely to deviate from truth in testimony, in court, because of her emotion. So a question I raise now at this point, aren't men also emotional? Women have a softness, which is correct, true, which is known, which cannot be disputed. But don't men also have certain emotions that can deviate them from the truth as well? For example, envy, ghadab, their chivalryness. All of these things they can use it in the same way. A woman's soft-heartedness, men can also have something that can deviate them, correct or not? Next slide. Let's have a look at the continuing tafsir of this great marja. He says for the following: so it is necessary for a woman like that meaning, who can be easily affected in her emotion, that to correct her mistake and be reminded of her responsibility. The matter is not a challenge to the dignity of women because of her soft-heartedness. Because being soft-hearted is not something against the value of her personality, but rather is a great human value to have such softness of heart. So this scholar, may Allah bless him, says, look, Allah is saying she's more prone to mistake because of her soft-heartedness. It's not a problem to be soft-hearted. It's a good thing. It's part of her insaniya that she is soft-hearted. I ask the question to you. Don't men also have the very same potential to deviate in a courtroom setting? Yes or no? Yes. You don't have to say yes if you don't believe it. Do you believe it? Yes. So I ask a simple question. My Lord, if men potentially have similar or same potentiality to deviate in a courtroom setting, why didn't you end up saying the same thing about a man? If a man deviates because of his own internal weaknesses, also get a second witness to back him up and help him and remind him and correct him.
But it is. The verse is saying two men. And if you can't
But
find
not for the purpose, two witnesses.
Yes.
But not for the purpose if one deviates. It's specific to women. If she deviates, if she makes a mistake, if she errs, the second witness should be there to back her up.
But if two women say something and that man say other thing, then it will also...
I'm not looking at the fiqh. I'm looking from a social perspective, yeah? I'm not interested in the fiqh here. I'm asking that question. If a man can also potentially deviate, why doesn't Allah say you should also have a man to back you up?
If man does say, everybody say you do this, it's what
So now we have to understand that maybe this verse isn't saying what we think it's saying. Maybe this verse is telling us something far more profound. And maybe we've been misreading this verse. And if we look at it in a different way, we will see a principle that is so profound, it will help us to understand how Islam is truly a resort for women. Now, let us just take a second and reconstruct what women were like at the time of the Arabian society of Islam. Were women allowed to be educated? No. Could women read and write? No. Could women speak out for themselves? No. Could women ever challenge man? Yes or no? No. Now overnight, the Prophet gives these rights to women. Yes or no?
Yep.
Now just because you've been given those rights overnight, does that mean that within your own being you are capable yet of practicing those things? If I gave a 15-year-old the keys to my car, he's never driven. Just because I give him the keys, does it mean that he's able to drive? No. The whole society for generation after generation after generation treated a woman in such a way that she had an inferiority complex within her. Now just because you allow her to go and stand in front of a judge, yes, she can go and stand in front of a judge, but you also have to realize that she may feel still inferior and incapable of properly standing in front of a judge. When the judge asks for a witness, she might become very nervous. When the judge inquires from her, when a lawyer comes and gives her a question and says, well, let me challenge your testimony, a person may fear because of the way in which they've always been treated. Socially, there was an environment where she was very weak. Now Islam is saying, if she comes to the courtroom and if she's unsure of herself, don't disregard her testimony. Get a second one to back her up. All along, feminism has been saying we want equity and equality and strengthening for women's rights. The Quran has been saying all along that in the situation in which she was considered weak, go and help her, go and strengthen her such that there is no longer any weakness for her. This is the greatest verse for women's empowerment. All along, women in that period were so disenfranchised, so much oppressed, that the way in which women were within themselves were without confidence. So if they went into a courtroom and gave testimony, they would have been so nervous, not able to even speak in front of the judge. Rather than disavowing her testimony altogether, the Quran said, keep her testimony, but help her. Bring her someone to go and help her, remind her, and then between the two of them, we'll be able to assist her. Look at the empowerment that's given to a woman in this situation. Now, don't think about this verse for its specificity. Think of it as a principle. Allah is saying, wherever you find weakness, wherever you find a woman not being given parity, not being given her equity, wherever it may be, in any sphere, the most important of which is testifying in front of a judge, wherever it may be, in the workplace, in the house, in the Husayniyah, in the masjid, in the parliament, wherever you see a woman being mistreated, not being given her rights, not being given her parity, go out of your way to ensure she is given her parity and equity in that scenario. Because if the Quran is giving her her parity when it comes to her testimony and empowering her, can you imagine what God is saying about any other given scenario? But because all along we've only looked at this verse through one lens to be able to say that it's all about half a witness and two witnesses and one witness, we've never gone further than this at all. The Quran is saying, at that time she wasn't having the confidence. Help her such that it can raise her to remove her inferiority and give her parity in that. Today, if we understood this, whichever scenario it may be, whichever space a woman may be mistreated in, downtrodden in, oppressed in, this principle is telling us, go and give her her empowerment. And this is how Islam would lead the discussion rather than having to follow feminist movements. It would take the power for women and help us to understand. When you read Surah Maryam, read it through the lens of Sayyida Maryam alayhi salam. When you see these verses, don't just look at it so blindly. Understand what was going on at the time of the Prophet. Apply it till today. And realize if we were to make this a resort for women, half the world could feel comfortable with Islam. And how many of them would pledge their love towards this religion that is empowering and assisting them in every stage of their life. Al-Abbas alayhi salam's title was the protector of women. I can't say it any better to you. You're about to cry over Abul Fadl. His title is the protector of women. Do you know why he's given this title? Because so long as he was present, none of the women of the camp of Hussein ever felt fear. And when they saw him departing from his tents, this was the first time that they felt that fear. When we say that we want to become like Al-Abbas, let us become like Al-Abbas. Let us become like Al-Abbas. That no women should fear, but rather they would feel confident in the protection that Al-Abbas would give to them. When Al-Abbas alayhi salam was born into this world, He was born into this world for that purpose of defending Hussein salamullahi alayhi. We are told in the Maqtal that when the body of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam was being taken to be buried next to the Holy Prophet, the wife of the Prophet forbade this and gave a signal such that arrows rained down on the janazah of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. 70 arrows, such that they needed to return to perform the ghusl and the kafan of Imam al-Hasan. The narration says, when Al-Abbas saw this tragedy unfold in front of his eyes, he immediately put his hand on his sword, ready to attack those that dared abuse the body of Imam al-Hasan. Abu Abdullah al-Hussein went to him, placed his hand on his chest, kissed him on his forehead and said, "Oh Abbas, today is not your day to fight." Throughout the afternoon, Abbas would come towards Imam al-Hussein and say, "Now is my turn to fight. Now I have been given the opportunity." And each time the Imam would refuse him from entering into the battlefield. After all of the martyrs had gone, after all the family members had been massacred, Abbas comes towards Abu Abdullah al-Hussein and says to him, "Oh my master, allow me." Imam responds again and says, "You are Sahib al-Liwa'i, you are the flag bearer of me, of my army. Oh Abbas, if you were to enter into the battlefield, who would be there to command my army?" To which we are told he responds by saying, "Oh my master Hussein, which army do you speak of? There is none left but you and I." At this point, Abbas uses the cries of the children as a means to be able to convince Hussein. At this moment, the children are crying out, "Al-Atash, Al-Atash, the thirst is killing us, the thirst is killing us." We are told that they used to run towards Abbas with their mashk or with a little bowl and say, "Abbas, is there any water that you can bring for us? Abbas, Asghar has gone quiet." Asghar was crying out. Now the thirst has overcome him. He has not even got the strength to cry, "Oh Abbas, please, our uncle, is there any water that you can bring for us?" It is at this point Hussein says, "Oh Abbas, I allow you to go and bring water for these children." Our Dhakirin tell us that when Abbas begins to put on his armor, as he begins to adorn himself with his sword and his armor, Sayyida Zainab alayhi salam comes out to him and says, "Oh Abbas, do you remember that when our father was breathing his last, he would tell us about the events of the 10th of Muharram. I never imagined, I never understood how it would appear that one day I would be returned back to Kufa, enchained, there a place where I was once held as a princess, that one day I would be held back in Kufa and that they would throw stones at me. I never understood how the day would come where they would try to sell me off as a slave in the marketplaces of Kufa. I never once imagined that they would throw fire at me. I never understood that they would come and abuse me. Until now, when I see you departing, now I realize these days have fallen upon Zainab." Al-Abbas, he has to enter into the battlefield. You can imagine what it must have been like for Ruqayya. You can imagine she must have gone to the tents of the children and said, "My uncle Abbas is going to fetch water. Asghar, do not cry any longer. Abbas is going to bring you water. Muhammad al-Baqir, do not cry any longer. Abbas is going to bring you water." We are told that there is a final embrace between these two brothers. Abbas enters in towards the battlefield. He begins to introduce himself. We are told that Abbas fights and he breaks through the barriers, the lines after the lines after the lines of these enemy hordes who are protecting the river Furat. There is 4,000 of the army on one side. There is 4,000 of the army on the other side. And we are told that when Abbas enters into the battlefield, he spreads the army, he shifts them from their place in a way in which it is a lion striking at the sheep. In a way in which they would have asked themselves, is this Abbas or is this Ali ibn Abi Talib fighting today on the 10th of Muharram? Eventually Abbas reaches towards the banks of the river Euphrates. He descends from his horse. He places his hands into that cold water and he raises it. Not because he is going to drink from himself, but rather to show history that even at this moment when Abbas has conquered the banks of the river Euphrates, if he wishes to be able to drink, he could have, but he would never put himself before Abu Abdullah al-Hussein and the children of Hussein. He throws that water away. He says, "O soul, Hussein is still thirsty." He places the mushk into that ground, into that water, and places it around him. And now Abbas ascends onto his horse and begins to return back towards the tents. I ask you, can you imagine Ruqayya? She must have been standing outside of those tents. She would have seen the alam of Abbas reach the banks of the river Euphrates, and she would have seen the alam returning. Sakina must have imagined that her uncle Abbas is returning with the water. How then do you tell Sakina what is about to happen to her uncle Abbas? Umar ibn Sa'ad calls out. He says, "Stop Abbas from reaching the camp of Hussein, for if water reaches them, we will not be able to fight them at all." What do they say at this moment? As Abbas is going towards the camp, he is riding. It is said that he is fighting off men from the right and from the left. One man is hiding like a coward from the side. He comes towards Abbas from the right hand side. He raises his sword. He strikes the right arm of Abu Fadl Abbas. The arm of Abbas begins to fall off from his arms. At this point, his sword even falls towards the ground. It is said now that he places that mushk towards his left and the liwa towards his left hand. Again, a man comes from the left side and strikes the left arm of Abu Fadl Abbas. This also falls towards the ground. It is said now that again they call out, "Make sure that not a drop of water reaches the camps of Hussein." We are told that that battalion in which had 4,000 archmen, they are told, "Make sure that not a drop of water reaches." They fire hundreds of arrows towards Abbas. There are hundreds of arrows flying towards him, but there are 3 arrows that struck Abu Fadl Abbas that I want to tell you about. The first arrow is the arrow that struck Abbas in the chest. The second arrow is the arrow that struck Abbas in his eye. We are told that when he is struck in his eye, he is unable to see because of the blood. With his horse, he turns the horse in a way in which drives towards the enemies. But there is still a third arrow that goes towards him. That third arrow is the most painful of all the arrows, because that arrow is the one that strikes the mushk, splitting open the water that would fall towards the ground. That arrow was the hardest for Abbas to have to face. At this moment, he turns his horse towards the enemies. They begin to attack him with their spears. They surround Abbas. Abbas is hanging towards the horse. He is hanging off the edge of the horse. The narration says, a man comes from behind. He takes the pole of one of the tents and strikes Abbas on the back of his head. The narration says that this strike is so powerful, it splits the head of Abbas open. It strikes him so hard that Abbas is forced to fall from his horse. You know this part of the Maqtal. One of the narrators said, one of the shuyukh said, I recited the Maqtal of Abu Fadl. That night I went to sleep and I saw in my dream Fatima al-Zahra Fatima came to me and said, you recited the maqtal of my son Abbas. Listen to that. You recited the maqtal of my son Abbas, but you did not recite the worst part of the maqtal of my son. He responded and said, O Sayyida Zahra, I recited that he was struck in his eye. She said, no, this was not the hardest thing, that he was struck by an arrow. I recited that he was struck on his head. She said, this was not the hardest thing for my son to bear. He said, then what was the hardest part of the maqtal of Abbas? She said, when every other one of the martyrs fell from their horse, they had their arms to break their fall. My son Abbas, his arms were cut from him. Then when he fell from his horse, he fell onto his face. The arrow was already in his eye, and it went further into the eye of Abu Fadl Abbas. Abbas fell towards the floor. His face struck the floor. It is then said that the enemies surrounded him and they cut him into pieces. قَطَّعُوهُ إِرْبًا إِرْبًا. The narrations mention, the book of Maqtal mentions, that one day when the water was filling up in the grave of Abu Fadl Abbas, it was said that he came in the dream of one of the ulama that he must have himself reburied. When they began to dig up the body of Abbas to rebury him, one of the scholars said, I began to cry and cry at the scene. They asked, why are you crying? He said, we were always told that Abbas was a giant of a man, but his grave is so small. Why is his grave so small? They began to read the Masa'ib of Abbas, that when he fell from his horse, the soldiers of Yazid came with their swords and cut Abbas into little pieces. When Hussein sees this scene, he calls out, now my back has become broken. Oh Abbas, how do I live without you after this? Hussein comes towards Abbas. Look at the scene that Abbas is in at this moment. He comes, the narration says that he lifts the head of Abbas onto his lap. Our Dhakirin tell us that he begins to say to him, do you have any last requests, oh my dear? He says, I wish to do the ziyarah of my master one last time. Clear the blood from my eyes so that I can see you one last time. He clears the blood from his eyes. Our Dhakirin tell us that at this moment, Hussein says to him, I too have a request for you, that all your life you have called me master. My brother, you have always been my brother. Call me brother one last time before you pass from this world. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Hussein is broken. There is no death more difficult for Hussein than what Abbas had to go through. Hussein is crying. We are told that Abbas, his last request was, leave me by the banks of the river Euphrates, for I am embarrassed to return back to Ruqayya without having brought her water. Oh my master, leave my body here. This is why the body of Abbas remains where it is. Hussein has to return back. As he does so, you can imagine, Sakina must have run out. Oh father, where is Abbas? What happened to my uncle Abbas? Our poets tell us in one of the Marthiyah, they write a poet that says that Sakina would cry and she would regularly say, oh my uncle, come back to me. Oh my uncle, I swear I will not ask for water anymore. Just come back to me once more, my uncle Abbas. What was Sakina? What was Zainab? What was Kulthum feeling without the return of their protector Abbas?
ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. Martin Hussein.